Hey guys, welcome back to the fanfic reread project. In this episode, we are finishing our reread of the first part of Prophs 3.0. As I mentioned last episode, we are kind of resetting now and moving on to a new draft of the story. So we are going back to the beginning and starting with a brand chapter. The air had a bite to it as the body swayed in the wind. Bran stared up at it with morbid fascination. He was still in his tattered black rags, but his shoes were gone, revealing a pair of ratty gray wool socks. There were blackened stumps where he'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite. The rope had to be slung under the arms, around the torso, because his head was gone. The image of the beheading was burned into his mind because he hadn't looked away when his father fired the gun. He even saw when he took out his greatsword and cut off the ragged remains of his head. They had to mop his brains off of the brownstone courtyard. Dried blood still decorated the stump at the top of his neck, flaked and rusty. Okay, so let's pause right here, because we've already run into a major change. In this version, instead of being beheaded by sword, as has happened in like pretty much every other version of Prophs up until now that had this chapter, he was shot in the head. So we're getting a big time skip here, actually. Well, time skip might not be the right word. Tech jump, I think, is better. Because as far as we know, the last few versions of Prophs, and this is much more prominent in Prophs 2.0 than in the last draft of this, clearly Prophs takes place in a time frame that is antiquated, but slightly more modern than what we see in the source material. So, like, if you remember in Prophs 2.0, there were mentions of gas lamps as well as photographs. So it's roughly like akin to the late 1800s, I would say, maybe the early 1900s. Whereas the last version of Prophs that we read, we genuinely don't really know when it takes place. It's just like there are horses and torches and stuff like that, because the story didn't really get far enough for us to leave Winterfell and see what the rest of Westeros was doing, which was kind of key to figuring out the tech jump in Prophs 2.0. Here, though, we've got guns. Now, I don't know if guns existed in the other versions of Prophs, but we definitely didn't hear about them. But having Ned behead, quote unquote, someone, execution style, like that's a big difference. That's just something I wanted to note because it's not super important. Yes, it is super important because it does change things, but we'll talk about that more later. Why do they hang it if Dad's already chopped off his head? Okay, so so one thing about this is that it's clearly an edit of the other story. So it does have some of the same issues that the other story has, with me copy and pasting prose and dialogue from the old version and then forgetting to change things. I don't think I ever mentioned this, but in the last draft, there is a line in Jon's chapter where he is referred to by his Elvish last name instead of the current last name that he had in this, which was Protz. It kind of threw me off, but of course I changed it because I was changing all the names anyway. And here we have Bran asking why they hang it if they chopped his head off, even though his head wasn't chopped off. So the people will know it's been taken care of, his brother Robb told him, and to warn anyone who'd try the same thing what'll happen to them. He was looking up at it too, but he didn't seem to be repulsed by it. He didn't seem bothered at all. Bran wasn't surprised. Robb was 18. He'd seen more than enough of these by now. Bran, on the other hand, was very new to it. Now a boy of 10, his father decided that it was high time he'd seen him dispense the king's justice. His mother had argued that he was far too young to see a man die, and by getting his head blown off, no less. Dad had only responded by saying, the sooner he sees, the better he knows, and the easier he'll go, and sheathing ice. She relented then, but not before calling him morbid for it. I like the way that I threw in the phrase, a boy of 10, considering how important it is to Bran as a character in this story. Even though it was all over, he still didn't know how he felt about it. That's why he was still staring at the thing as it hung over the castle's timber wall. He didn't really know how it would help him die either, but it didn't scare him anymore. Or at least he didn't think it did. He finally tore himself away from it at the sound of his father's voice. Bran didn't eat much of his dinner, nor did he talk very much when they went back to the trucks. Oh, there we go. It was rare for our man not to conduct an execution he ordered himself here, but Mr. Glover was all the way out on the other side of the country. When father usually executed a man, it was in a field to the south of their home. Deepwood Motte was 300 miles from home, deep within the Wolf's Wood, and only accessible by one road, which meant a long and dark ride back through the forest. They wouldn't get home until around midnight. Bran sighed and watched the setting sun flash red through the trees. Alright, so this is a place I wanted to stop because I mentioned it in, I think, the first episode of this entire thing when I read the first version of the Bran chapter. In that chapter, I noted the fact that it was really weird that it apparently was only going to take the characters like 5 or 6 hours to get home when they were traveling many miles through the Wolfswood to Winterfell on horse. And this story really only confirms how ridiculous it is because apparently I just took the same amount of time that I thought it would take by horse and then applied it to car, which is much more realistic because you can travel a few hundred miles by car in a few hours. That's completely normal. But to travel 300 miles by horseback, you could not do that in a day the way that they did in that other story. And I think this story does a good job of actually making it more plausible because of the cars. Also, this story does a better job of explaining exactly why Ned is the one who had to go do this execution instead of Galbart Glover. Because I made a big deal about this in the first episode. I was like, it's really weird that the story keeps talking about how Ned always performs these executions in this one field, as if he has to always go and do the executions because he's the Warden of the North or whatever. Where this story clearly states, like, Galbart Glover would have done it, but he's not home. So while he passed the sentence, he can't swing the sword, because it makes sense that the people at Deepwood Mott would call him about this, but even though he can't do anything, so then he calls Ned. Like, it makes a lot more sense instead of Galbart Glover is like, I sentence you to die. All right, let me call up Lord Stark and get him to chop your head off. Like, that doesn't make any sense. It still doesn't explain why the Starks usually do their executions in that field south of their houses, because those are their lands, but whatever. He was a sad sight, that one, Rob muttered from the front seat. When brave enough, though, I suppose. He was the oldest out of all of them, though all 3 of the older boys were 18. He had their father's broad build, but their mother's auburn hair, thick freckles, and blue eyes. I like the way that describing the kids is used to describe the parents in turn. How would you know, Jon asked. He barely moved. He was their half-brother, the youngest of the 3 by months, but he looked more like a Stark than any of his full-blood siblings. The birthmark that creeped up the side of his face was even darker than their father's. Exactly. He didn't fight his fate, Robb said back. Theon Greyjoy let out a chuckle. If you say so, Stark, though he didn't look like he could fight if he wanted to. He was their father's ward and no blood relation to them, but he'd been around since before Bran was born. He had sea-green eyes and salty blonde hair, and light brown birthmarks that trailed over and down his right eyebrow. I thought he was half dead as it was, he continued. Did you see the bloke? He had frostbite. So, Jon said with a shrug. It's the middle of the summer, Snow. It's been summer for ages, Greyjoy, Jon reminded him. He probably came down from near the wall or something. It's always winter up there. Oh, what was he thinking, wandering into the village? He killed 3 people, Robb said matter-of-factly. I think it was pretty obvious. Don't give me sarcasm, Stark, Theon said, mimicking his brother's tone. Robb rolled his eyes and punched him lightly on the arm. Bran laughed for the first time that day. Suddenly the car swerved, and Robb cursed under his breath. What the hell was that? Why is that not... You know what, never mind. Oh, Theon said that line. That's why. Okay, I should have made that more clear. A wolf, Robb answered tightly. Did you hit it? Jon asked. Robb shook his head, but as soon as he did, a loud wail of a howl cut through the air. It wasn't anything like the dogs in the kennels or the wolves you could usually hear at night. It sliced through him like a hot knife in butter and shook him to his core. They looked at each other, and Robb unholstered his gun. Bran was caught off guard by the scramble that followed as the other 2 followed him out of the car. He didn't know whether he should go or not. He thought he'd seen more than enough for the day, but he also didn't want to sit in the car by himself. I guess I shouldn't say this now, but I'm going to. This version of the story, I can tell that I actually sat down and rewrote this. Every once in a while, I'll come across a line or like a dialogue exchange that was clearly in the first version of this story, so you can tell it's still a newer draft of the same thing. But instead of just copying and pasting large portions of the old text, I actually went back and rewrote the old text so it reads better. That's one really nice thing about this story too, is that this reads a lot better than the other version. So far, I am enjoying this much more than I enjoyed the first Bran chapter in the last version of this version of Prophs. Jesus Christ. But yeah, let's keep going. The sun hadn't gone down completely, but the trees had gone so dense that they blocked out any of the light. The only source of light near him was the headlights of the truck. All right. You don't need to say light that much. They only shone on the road in front of him, and there was a red stain on the dirt. He tensed. Maybe he should have stayed in the car after all. It was called the Wolfswood for a reason. There was another spat of cursing, and then a flashlight beam appeared behind him. Bran nearly jumped out of his skin before he realized that it was his dad. Jory Cassell, the captain of the guard, was right behind him. Why did he stop? He asked. What are you doing out here? There was a wolf, Bran started, and Ned's dark gray eyes widened, but before he could finish, he heard his brother yell, "Bloody hell!" They followed the shout into the underbrush, and after another moment's hesitation, Bran went with them. All right, this is something that I don't think really started to come up until the next version of Prophs 3.0. Why do they keep leaving Bran alone? I don't get it. Like, I know in the other version, this all happened when they were at the house, so they could have left Bran alone and he could have just went inside. But they are in the middle of the woods. They come out and they're like, why are you outside? And then they hear Robb, they leave. They don't tell Bran to get back in the car, they just go. Or they don't even tell Bran, like, okay, stay with us or get in the car. This is really weird, especially because I think in the very newest version of Prophs, I'm pretty sure Ned specifically has Bran stay in the car. I just don't know why they didn't have him, like, get back in the car or something. The shrubs of the underbrush seemed to materialize out of the dark as the lights passed by them. They came upon the boys in a clearing, standing over something lying on the ground. Jory walked around them, and when he caught sight of whatever it was, it gave him a start. His dad grimaced at the sight of it. He pushed between Robb and Theon to see it for himself and gasped. Okay, this story is already showing some issues with playing the pronoun game. There are multiple times where the story is clearly referring to Bran about something, but it's right after talking about, like, his dad or one of his brothers, so it sounds like it's still talking about them. It's very confusing. Just looking at the back, it looked like a pile of gray fur, like a huge blanket that had been dropped on the ground. As he circled around it, he found its head, with its mouth pulled back to reveal stained fangs, and then a pool of blood that come from somewhere under its body. One of its eyes was still partially open, but all he could see were the veins. When Jory reached down and touched the thing, he declared, "It's still warm." "I didn't know they got this big," Theon said. "They don't," Harwin, one of his father's guards, declared. "It's a direwolf." Okay, Harwin's job keeps changing. Since when is Harwin a guard? Whatever. "That's impossible," his father, Hullen, exclaimed. "Lower your voices," Jory said, crouching down in front of its head. "They've been extinct for hundreds of years." There were murmurs of agreement at that. "There's nothing else it could be," Harwin said. "It's too big to be anything else." "He's right," Robb said firmly. Theon rolled his eyes. Okay, so this is another thing that I've found weird about these versions of Prof so far. I know it makes sense for Harwin and Hullen to have stuff to say, because they're there in the books. But I feel like the line about it being a direwolf shouldn't be given to this random side character. This is especially a thing because I'm pretty sure in the books Jon is the one who declares that it's a direwolf. And that seems like it's kind of significant. But here it's just like, oh, Harwin says it's a direwolf. And it's like, well, what's the significance of that, you know? But anyway, Bran didn't really take in any of the conversation around him. His eyes were glued to the thing's mouth and all of the blood covering the fur there. He thought of his sister Arya and the way she'd tease him by telling him the wolves in the Wolfswood were massive monsters with slavering jaws and fangs that could tear through bone. To think that she could have been right, it had shocked him into silence. Was this the thing that had run in front of their truck? Oh god, I just realized, like, you know what? The story never says what direction the thing that ran in front of their truck ran. That's really creepy, actually. Oh my god. Like, one thing I will say about Profs that I actually do like, but it's not really as apparent until some of the later versions, is the way that it builds up the mystery of what's going on beyond the wall without ever showing you what's going on beyond the wall. If you remember back in the first episode of this reread series, Bran's chapter mentioned that the guy that they killed at Deepwood Motte had really mysterious wounds on his face that Bran said kind of looked like claw marks or something like that. That was a really weird little detail that just kind of came up and then was never mentioned again. And then when the wolf died, the wolf had some really weird injuries as well, and I think that's a thing here. But this line made me realize that we don't entirely know, like, what else is in the woods, which then made me think about some later versions of Pross where there is much more concrete proof that there is some type of weird creature lurking in the Wolfswood. But yeah, I kind of like these little details, but let's keep going. The sound of a tiny whimper pulled him out of his thoughts. Something brushed up against his leg and he jumped. When he looked down, a pair of yellow eyes stared back up at him. Easy, John told him quietly. It's only little. The wolf had cubs? He kneeled down tentatively and the thing hopped up and licked his face. That was the second time he smiled that night. Are there more? John nodded. I counted 3 others. He was holding one of them in his arms like a baby, and he could just catch the reddish color in its coat in the dark. It had yellow eyes, too. He spotted another curled up into a ball at the foot of its mother's corpse, its fur a very pale gray. The fact that this wolf has pups, that lends even more credence to the idea that the thing that ran in front of their car was not this dire wolf. Oh god, that's... wow. Keys. This is weird for me because it's been a while since I caught on to this. And to be honest, I'm not even sure if I did this on purpose because knowing me and some of the writing snafus that I've had in profs in the past, I could have had it been the direwolf. But as it stands without knowing, this is coming off as actually being kind of creepy and I like it. Do you know what killed her? He heard his dad ask, which changed the focus of his attention again. It's hard to tell, Jory answered. Her stomach's been torn open. That sounds about it. I'd think so, but something's in her neck too. I didn't get a proper look at it because it's under her, but... He trailed off as Ned came over and reached under himself. His glove came back bloody, holding what looked like an antler of some animal. You know what that's from, sir? I've noticed that there are a lot of not modern terms, but definitely more regular English terminology. If you read A Song of Ice and Fire, because of the fact that they live in a society where there are knights, they don't refer to their male superiors as sir, because that's an indication that you're speaking to a knight. However, due to the cultural changes, I will say, in the North, it kind of makes sense that that doesn't have that connotation, especially because even in the books, knights aren't really a thing in their religion anyway. But it is notable, and they also referred to Galbart Glover as Mr. Glover instead of just like Lord Glover. That's a big change. I don't think we're going to get to talk about why that is a thing, so I might come back to that at the end. I'll pin that. Hopefully I'll remember. Dad turned it over in his hand. A stag. A strange quiet fell over the group, though it only lasted a moment. Jory shook his head. Either way, what are we going to do with them? He pointed to a pup that was staring him down, its little paws wet with blood. I love the little wolves. I want to keep it, Bram piped up before anyone could say anything. He had a bad feeling that none of the adults had the same idea, and the frown that crossed his father's face proved it. A wolf isn't a pet, sweetling, he responded. Those pups might be sweet now, but when they're full grown, they could turn around and rip you apart. Not if we train them. We don't know if you can, Jory started, but Bran didn't let him finish. But you can train them. I know you can. That's how we got dogs anyway. Oh, God, Bran. Oh, man. John placed a hand on his shoulder and shushed him. Not so loud. Dad, look what we're standing under. Rob shined his flashlight up toward the forest canopy and revealed branches white as snow with leaves black as night. He recognized it as an ink tree, though he'd never seen one in person. He knew the look of all the holy trees. They all did. It's an omen, Hullen said darkly. We don't take stock in omens, his father retorted. Oh, I like that. It's not an omen, Rob corrected, but this wolf, the one on our sigil, dies under a heart. It's not a coincidence either. Theon shook his head in disbelief. And there's 4 of them, John added. You too? Man, this chapter's got everything, doesn't it? You have 4 kids, sir. They were meant to have them. And what about you? Ned asked. That's not my surname, he said with a shake of the head. Again, the pronoun game. Just say it John said it. There's too many he's in this scene. Literally every character in this scene uses the same pronouns. You can't do this. Bran's heart swelled when he realized that John had left himself out to make the numbers match. His father looked down at the 2 pups remaining on the ground and then back at the 2 in their arms. Fine, then. You'll raise them yourselves, feed them yourselves, and train them yourselves. Don't pass them off to the help or anything. God's help you if you mistreat them. He paused to take a deep breath. Are you sure you still want this? Yes, Bran answered eagerly. Rob nodded in agreement. Get the other 2 then. Cat is going to have a fit when she sees them, he muttered as he turned back toward the road. The other men followed behind him, leaving Bran with the older boys. Again, Bran is tense. Stop leaving him alone in the woods. I can't believe this, Theon said, shaking his head. What? Rob bent over and scooped up the pup with the bloody paws, which wiggled in his arms. Get that one over there, will you? It's not a coincidence, he echoed. He picked up the one that had been curled up. It was so small that it fit in just one of his arms, and it rolled over, asleep. What? He said again. It's true. Theon just shrugged. Okay, see, this is what I'm talking about. Theon and Rob are having a conversation back and forth, but it keeps saying, oh, he said, he muttered. Like, you can't. Who is talking? Like, you need to be more specific. You two done then? Jon asked. He started for the road, and Bran went behind him, but he stopped when he heard another whimper. Is that? Bran caught sight of it in the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. He pointed to it. There! Jon pushed apart the branches of a shrub and then reached in and pulled out another pup. It was ghost white, with icy blue eyes. He must have crawled away from the others, Jon murmured. He comes too. Let's go, Robb said. The way back to the tracks was darker than he remembered, though the amount of flashlights was the same. He figured that it must have been because the sun was finally down now. He wondered if there were any more wolves around, but tried to shake off the nerves. His dad had told him that wolves didn't attack people unprovoked anyway, and he couldn't think of anything that he might have been doing at the moment that would make them angry. A shadow passed in the beam of Robb's flashlight in front of him, and Bran froze in place. What was that? Robb didn't answer him. Instead, he disappeared into the underbrush and then came back with yet another pup. This one was black, with eyes that looked like they were gray or green, depending on the way the light was shining. Is he one of them? Jon asked. He is now, Robb declared. This one's yours, Greyjoy. Theon raised an eyebrow. What? You're welcome. And that's the end of that chapter. Alright, I'll tell you right now, I like this a lot more than the other one. That wasn't bad at all. I enjoyed this. It's so nice. It's really sad because the last version of Prophs that we read, I did not have fun reading that at all. So I'm mostly just glad that this version was actually, like, readable. But this chapter really does have it all. It has its creepy moments, it has funny moments, it has tons of symbolism. I really like this. Hey guys, Editing Frankie here. I just wanted to note before I go into the next thing I'm going to talk about that this chapter has, like, no atmosphere. I know I said before, like, it has its creepy moments, but outside of the realization that the thing that ran in front of their car might not have been a direwolf, there's nothing creepy that happens in this chapter. Like, there's no evocative language. For as much as the other version of the chapter really wasn't that good, it still had that bit where they're riding through the woods and the sun is like painting the red across things, and that's used to like describe the boys and how the light plays off their features or whatever the fuck. Like, even just something as small as that does set the scene. And this is very basic in the way that it goes about setting the scene. There's no real, like I said, evocative language. And this is a constant feeling I had while re-listening to this. At the very beginning, when Bran is looking up at the body, his discomfort is like clearly there, but it's not palpable at all. I don't know. It's just like, because of that, this chapter did feel a little flat, but clearly I enjoyed it at the time, so that does count for something too. Anyway, let's get back to it. One thing I did want to point out before we moved on to the next chapter was the symbolism, in particular with the pups. So the pups are symbolic in and of themselves as extensions of the Stark kids and representations of them. But this chapter also adds another layer of symbolism by having the wolves be doing different things and look a certain way to match each of the kids that they end up going to. So the little tiny gray one was asleep the entire time, and that's Sansa's wolf lady. So there is a reason why that one is always asleep. Theon's wolf's eyes are gray and green depending on which way the light hits. That's symbolic of Theon's identity struggle between identifying more as a Greyjoy or as a Stark. I won't talk about Jon's because it's kind of spoilery, though then again, Game of Thrones is over now, so I guess it's not that much of a spoiler. But Jon's wolf is white with blue eyes. This one's also hard because we don't ever get to see any Targaryens, but in Prophs, the Targaryens are known for having white hair and blue eyes, like in the show. So that is sort of signaling R plus L equals J, those types of things. Arya's little wolf was kind of like standing and staring at people with blood on its paws. That's foreshadowing of Arya possibly becoming a faceless man or killing people, whatever would have happened here. The added layer of symbolism to match each of the wolves to the person that they're going with, as well as the fact that the general order that they're found in, not the 4 original wolves that we see, but Jon and Theon's wolves in particular, the fact that they're found after the fact is symbolic of the fact that the 2 of them were kind of brought into the family, quote unquote, after the fact. Lots of good symbolism there. So now let's move on to the second chapter, which is John's chapter. The sun seemed to turn the entire sky white, or at least that was the way it looked when he looked up through the canopy of the trees. The arms of the heart were pitch black, and the leaves glowed red as they shook in the breeze. John's body couldn't decide if it was hot or cold as he closed his eyes against the light. It always felt too bright out here in the Godswood. His eyes opened suddenly when his pup jumped into his lap. Ghost, he was called now, and the fur on his legs had turned pink from the sap-stained ground. Why was it always so bright out here? So, one thing I've noticed in later versions of the story is that I stopped explaining the whole, like, oh, when light touches the branches of the godswood, it gets brighter, and that's because the gods. Because that was kind of a staple of every chapter that took place in the godswood. If you remember back in like Prophs 1.0 and Prophs 2.0, whenever the requisite Theon goes to the Godswood chapter would come up, there would be a small explanation of like, Lord Stark told him that the light amplifies because the old gods, and like, I completely cut that out now. And I kind of like it. It is weird though, because this is such a strange like phenomenon that does not happen in the books at all. You'd think explaining it would make sense, but at the same time, I also like that it's not info dumping on you left and right for kind of no reason. I'm sure I would have explained it later on in the story in some way that made more sense and was more natural. But anyway, you really think the gods gave them to you? Theon asked from his place on the rock next to him. He had a hand on Shadow to keep him from rolling on the ground and getting sticky. No, Rob answered from where he was kneeling. He was bent over, his arms stretched out toward the massive trunk of the bleeding tree in prayer. I'm out here because I needed the stretch. When he sat up again, he turned and gave Theon a look. Of course I do. And it's us. They gave you one too. He turned back, and John knew he was making the five-pointed star over his chest with his hand while he muttered under his breath. He knew the rituals, though he hardly ever did them. Not that there were that many. I don't really know the significance of the five-pointed star in this. I'm assuming it has something to do with the number of heart trees, because for a long time in Prophs, there were 5 different species of heart trees until very recently when I decided to throw in 2 more because of 7 being such a significant number as it was. So I guess it's connected to that. But anyway, of course they did, Theon said, looking back at his pup again, who was now leaping at the water of the pond behind them. Still can't believe we have them at all. My father knows the work of the gods when he sees it, Rob told him. You should too, Greyjoy. Theon raised an eyebrow. Should I? Rob came and sat down in front of them. John does. John, who'd bent over and rested his head on Ghost's back, only answered with an Why Shadow? Okay, so this is one of those parts that kind of doesn't make sense when I translate, quote-unquote, the names. In general, the reason why Theon's wolf is called Shadow is because that's sort of a general approximation of all of the different names he's had. But this part's not going to make much sense because Shadow's not like a terribly dark name. This has come up in multiple stories. Like, if you remember in the last version of this chapter, Sansa's like, oh, what are you going to name your wolf, Theon? And he's like, I'll name it Shadow. And then she's like, oh my god, that's so morbid. Like, it's Shadow, you know? But in the other version, when the wolf's name was Mordred, that made a little bit more sense because that had to do with death, I think, or something like that. So anyway, why Shadow? Rob asked him. Because I am a terrible and dark man who likes morbid things. Shadow came back, jumped onto his lap, and licked his face, obviously. Okay, there's some typos in this next part that make it kind of confusing to read, but I'll try my best. They say that the Boltons strung the bodies of the pain rebels in their heart tree so the crows could eat them, John told him. That's why the flowers are pink instead of blue. Theon raised an eyebrow. Why did you just tell me that? Because you're a terrible and dark man who likes morbid things, Rob answered with a laugh. Do you really believe that? Theon asked. Every weeping widow has blue flowers except that one, Rob said with a shrug. He began to pet Greywind absently when he settled by his side. His fur was the same shade of dark blood red as Rob's hair in the sun. Makes sense. Not really. Did they really string them up? It was 1,000 years ago. No one knows for sure, John started, but they were Boltons, so they probably did, Rob finished. Okay, so once again, we are reading through a version of Prophs and the Boltons are very randomly brought up. I don't know why I was so keen on establishing them so early on when there are a bunch of other northern families who are also pretty important. I like the way that this sort of shows off northern culture and how history and legend so effortlessly kind of blend together and people just don't even really consider the difference between the two. By the way, I also think it's worth mentioning that one of the types of heart trees was in this version called a that it said that the weeping widow, which is a, if you know what a weeping willow looks like, imagine that but with flowers. In this story, they have blue flowers, but the Bolton's tree has red flowers for some reason. And that's what they're talking about here. And the fact that people say, like, oh yeah, it's because they strung up these rebels from this war and it dyed the flowers pink. And everyone's like, yeah, that sounds about right, except for Theon. That's totally like a good way of showing off how their culture kind of operates. This was slightly more apparent in later versions of Props, but those versions don't have any prose for them, so we're not going to be able to see that. But anyway, why? Theon asks. They were traitors. They didn't deserve the dignity of a burial, Jon said. Not that there was anyone to bury them. Robb smirked. Is that not morbid enough for you? Theon let out a sigh. I just can't bring myself to believe in gods. I haven't been given any reason to. Robb looked from him to his pup and then back to him again. It was a coincidence. You cannot possibly tell me that you're denying the circumstances under which we found that wolf. What circumstances? Theon asked incredulously. Dead? Robb glared at him. Yes, dead, but also under a heart. One the same colors as my family sigil, I remind you, with a stag's antler in its throat. Okay, for one, I thought you all didn't take stock in omens. And two, that doesn't even make sense, because King Robert is your dad's best friend. And what about the stomach wound? Jon asked. I still can't figure that out myself, Robb admitted. Maybe because it doesn't mean anything, Theon said. Now it was Robb's turn to roll his eyes. I thought it was from that wolf, but it would have killed the pups. I think. Like I said, Theon said matter-of-factly. Whatever. It wasn't even the right heart, Theon continued. Of course it wasn't, Jon said, finally sitting back up. He squinted in the sunlight. This is the only one south of the wall. That's why they made the Starks the kings of the north. He finished his sentence with a wince. He felt a dull pain in his temple every time his blood pulsed. It's not the same line, but I just had a flashback to The Dark Knight Rises and the pain, something in time with his pulse. Oh my god. With every beat of his heart. Jesus Christ. I thought I'd seen the last of that line, but apparently not. Are you alright? Theon asked him. Jon nodded. I'm fine. It's just a headache. Robb got to his knees and put a hand to his forehead. Jon flinched slightly at the touch. You're warm, he declared. Something's going to happen. Theon eyed him. Really? It always does, he insisted. He was in bed with a migraine when we found out that Lord Aaron had died, remember that? So? He got so sick he nearly died that time your dad rebelled against the crown. Again. So? Something's going to happen. He ran his thumb over Jon's cheek and looked into his face like he was searching for something. Jon just stared back into his steely blue eyes. The question is what? Theon started to respond, but he was interrupted by a shout of, Brother! From across the clearing. All three of them turned to find Sansa standing where the other trees stopped, with little lady at her feet. How did she get here by herself? He asked instead. Jon wondered it too. She was not completely blind, but she couldn't see well enough to travel through what was effectively a forest. She knows the way, Robb stated. She's gone it enough times. What is it, Sansa? Have you heard? She asked excitedly. Mummy says the king is coming. The queen will be with him, she added dreamily. And the princess? And the princess too. Isn't it wonderful? Robb looked up at Theon and mouthed, I told you so. When Theon looked at him, Jon only shrugged and responded with an, And that's the end of that chapter. I like that. I feel like this chapter is much more about something than the original version was. Because if you remember, I don't want to say I hated it, but I really did not like the original version of this chapter from the first episode. It started out a lot like this one, with the characters sort of being like, do you really think the gods gave us these pups? Do you really think it's like fate or whatever? And then it was very suddenly hijacked by the pup naming chapter from Prophs 2.0, and I was just like, ugh. And it really made me question why I was reading this through Jon's eyes specifically. At least in this chapter, that question never occurred to me. And this chapter definitely felt a lot more focused. So it's all about that one thing. It's about introducing us to the three older boys by showing us their differences in beliefs. So you have Robb, who is the very superstitious one who believes in the omens and the signs and all that stuff, and he's clearly the more religious one. You have Theon, who is not religious and is a skeptic, and then you have Jon, who's just kind of like there, seemingly in the middle. And I think this chapter does a good job of not just portraying that, but giving me a reason why this is in John's POV. Having the character who's in the middle be the one who's showing this allows us as the audience to have a middle ground in the conversation, because we don't really understand why there is this difference between them. But when we come in at John's level, we can kind of see it with a person who's much more moderate. As well, it also shows off some character quirks of John's in particular, what with his migraines and such. And it has world building. Yeah, altogether, I think this chapter is really good. There were a few bumps in there, some typos that made things a little confusing. The part where they start talking about the Boltons is a little bit like abrupt, even though the actual world building and the character stuff that comes out of it is really interesting. But outside of that, it's pretty decent. So now we will move on to the third and last chapter, which is an Arya chapter. Do I have to wear that dress? Arya shivered in the cool air of the washroom as a maid patted her down with a towel. She'd been scrubbed so hard that even her birthmark looked reddened and her skin felt raw. Her mother and Septim Dane, her tutor, had picked out the dress she was going to wear today. The gray silk was trimmed with white lace and embroidered with black flowers. She'd never seen it before, which meant that it was new, and that meant that it was bound to be tight. Okay, so this is something that I've always wondered about. If Arya has new clothes, aren't they usually made specifically for her? So why would they be tight? I mean, like, I guess to an extent, new clothes are always a little bit like, but that's the thing though. The whole concept of, oh, new clothes are always ill-fitting only exists in a society where clothes are always ready-made and bought like that. Not a society where you have a actual industry of people making clothes specifically for you, like they probably do in this world. So, I mean, I guess that's kind of like world building that we can't really get into, but it's just something I've been wondering about. So moving on. Of course, the king is coming. You have to look your best. She let out a sigh, but she didn't fight them as they slipped the thing on over her small clothes. It felt like it was squeezing her sides. She was slipped into tights and patent leather shoes, and they put her hair up in a velvet ribbon. She always hated to look this nice. Somehow, she'd make a mess of things. It had excited her at first, the thought of seeing the royal family for herself, but as time went on, the idea became more and more stressful. Septim Dane had been down on her during her etiquette lessons, which were the ones she hated the most. Her sister had been ringing around the house about the visit ever since they'd heard, and that always annoyed her. Her father, on the other hand, had been down, because the visit itself was prompted by the death of her uncle John Arryn, who had also been his foster. She just wanted everything to stop for a moment, but that wasn't possible today. She was brought downstairs and found her whole family dressed in shades of gray and white. Her older brothers had been shaved, and Theon as well, and her father's beard was neatly trimmed. Sansa looked so much like their mother, her hair shining like beaten copper. The fabric of her dress was the same shade of shining silver as her eyes. Before they stepped outside, they were all wreathed in black leathers and furs that gleamed in the sunlight. So, I wanted to note right away that so far this chapter has been focusing a lot more on Arya's feelings about the visit of the king, and I like that, because one of the main problems with the first version of this chapter in Prophs 3.0 is that it was very clearly not about Arya at all, which I also found weird, because even in Prophs 2.0, I managed to have the chapter seem like it was about Bran and Arya. Back then it was a Bran chapter, but still, instead of them going and finding out what the heck their dad was doing, they went off to the Godswood and did the thing. So that made it seem like the whole point of the chapter was it was about them and it was introducing this magical element. And somehow that then translated into a chapter told through Arya's POV that's all about Ned being named Hand for some reason. So I like that so far this chapter has focused on Arya's feelings about all this rather than just like having her be there. But anyway, the whole of their house had turned out in front of the castle, from the guard to the help, all looking their absolute best. Her mother arranged her so that she stood next to her younger brother. "Do you really think the king will ask Daddy to be Hand?" Bran asked her quietly. She nodded. Why else would he come? She knew that the king and her father were old friends. They had squired together, gone to war together, and won the kingdom together. Were it not for the Kingslayer, they'd probably have slain King Aerys together as well, and Lord Arryn had fostered them both. It made too much sense. Sansa shushed them as they were approached by a sea of discreet-looking black vehicles, with flags flying from their windows blazoned with red and blue. From the one in the front outstepped a man who was a sight to be seen. He was huge, fat with a round belly and at least a half a foot taller than her father, with piercing blue eyes that were the color of a pale sky. He wore a suit in rich blue embroidered with the image of a stag in silver, the king's colors. She was a bit taken aback by the realization that this was the king, but the halo of silver antlers in his thick black hair confirmed. So this paragraph is interesting because it takes lines from the old version, slightly rewritten, but they're presented in a very different order. I'm always kind of intrigued by times where I will write something and then in a later edit have the same paragraph, but have the lines switched around somehow, and then how that changes the retelling. I can't really get into detail with analyzing this right now without looking at the other one, but still, that's just interesting to note. "Ned," he said jovially, "it's been too long." He spoke with an accent that curled some of his words. "Your Grace," her father said, bowing his head, "Winterfell is yours." One thing I will say is that usually this is the part where the character realizes, oh, this is the king. The king looked him up and down. "You've gotten fat," he said disapprovingly. She saw Ned tense, and then his eyes flicked down to the king's immense gut. The king let out a laugh and pulled her father into a crushing hug. He then moved to her mother and hugged her like she was a sister. That seemed to signal for the rest of the party to exit their cars. So I like that in this version, instead of a bunch of horses, they pull up in a bunch of, like, Secret Service cars, basically. That's kind of a nice touch. Amongst the many retainers, her eyes spied the queen, a slender woman with golden hair that cascaded in loose manicured curls over her shoulders. Her eyes were striking turquoise, and the reddened mark on the pale skin at the right side of her neck marked her as a Lannister. She wore the colors of her king, but unemblazoned by either his sigil or hers. She was flanked on either side by the royal children. On her left was Princess Marcella, the spitting image of her mother but only 11, and Prince Tommen, a plump boy of 9. At her right was Prince Joffrey, the oldest, tall as his mother with eyes the color of spring water and a smug look about him that Arya disliked immediately. So this is the first story where the Lannisters' colors have actually been the colors that they have in the source material. I don't know why I went through that period where the Lannister colors were purple and gold. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that it might have something to do with the fact that every Lannister who wasn't Cersei in this story, and I guess Tyrion, had ambitions to put a Lannister on the throne. So changing their colors to purple was meant to signal that because they wanted to be royalty, and purple in the past was the color of royalty. But that's also kind of like, I get it, but it's kind of like pointless. Like, I don't know. Behind them was the Kingslayer, Sir Jaime, the Queen's older brother. He had that Lannister look just like his sister, but his eyes were sharp sapphire blue. He wore the white uniform of the Kingsguard, complete with a sword and a scabbard inlaid with gold that was never used. Gallant as he looked, something about him put Arya off. It might have been the slight look of disdain he wore as he looked over the castle walls. So this is interesting. Why are Cersei's eyes turquoise, but Jaime's eyes are sapphire blue? The thing about this is that I do actually know why I changed the colors of the Lannisters' eyes in this story, but I don't understand how it at all does what I wanted it to do. Essentially, and this is partially something that I actually picked up in the show, but I realized it played into a mystery here. But once Ned realized that something was off about the royal kids and their looks, there was supposed to be a sort of like, but is there question regarding Joffrey in particular. Because while Joffrey is clearly like blonde-haired, he still has blue eyes. And because Cersei also has blue eyes, it becomes sort of complicated. So is he blonde because Jaime's his dad, or is he blonde because Robert's grandmother was a Targaryen, so there is a light-haired gene somewhere in his genetics? And this was supposed to be a thing. That's why the Lannisters seem to have blue eyes. But Cersei having turquoise eyes while Jaime's eyes are dark blue does not in any way help with that at all. Outside of the fact that it would guarantee that Cersei and Robert's kids most likely had blue eyes. But if that was the case, then why not also give Cersei the same, like, sapphire blue eyes? Like, the whole reason why Jaime and Cersei's eyes are the specific color they are in the books is because it's supposed to tip you off to the fact that the Baratheon kids are actually Lannisters because all of their eyes are green like their moms, where Robert's other kids' eyes are always blue, or their hair is always black. It's just weird. But anyway, They went through all of the formalities once the family had come forward. She bowed for the king, and again for the queen, and then again for the children. Sansa blushed when Prince Joffrey kissed her hand. She didn't find much she liked about the younger children, but nothing she really disliked either. Bran seemed to take to Tommen, though, which was good. He didn't have many friends besides her. By the time it was done, she felt exhausted. Everyone was led back to the house, and her coat was removed from her shoulders once more, letting the cold air seep in through the fabric of her dress. The sounds of chatter bounced off the walls as the two families moved down the hall, exchanging polite small talk and catching up with whatever they'd missed since the last time they'd seen each other. One thing I will say that the story does seem to have quite a few of is run-on sentences. I mean, they're well-written run-on sentences, but God, they're long. She realized they would probably move to the sitting room now, the biggest one, with the large tapestries and rugs, the furniture gilded and covered in embroidered silk, and the small talk. Ugh, the small talk. She didn't know if she could take it. She scanned the group of people around her, and her family were all a step ahead of her. She took the opportunity to duck behind a door. Arya found herself in a small room and squeezed behind a chair. If she could just wait for everyone to clear out, she would be able to get out of here, and then she would go to the crypts. It was a habit that she had picked up over the years. When things got too hectic, she'd go down into the family crypts. Down there, she could have privacy like no other. It was almost like the old wooden doors were impenetrable. After waiting a good few minutes, she got up and put an ear to the door. She could hear the sound of scattered footsteps, but the traffic from earlier was long gone. She had her hand on the doorknob, poised to turn it, when she heard the voices. "Is that any way to speak of my husband, brother?" she heard someone say. The voice was all flowery, and the accent tight. She knew the voice of every attendant in the castle, and none of them sounded like that. "The dead will wait, dear sister," someone else said back. They had a voice like warm honeyed wine, but one she still didn't recognize. "He's the king." Oh, well, that explained it then. "If he'd like to go to the crypts as soon as he comes on the grounds, he can. Doesn't it bother you that he still kneels at the feet of his former betrothed when she has been dead for 17 years? He should be kneeling to his queen." "Please," the queen scoffed. There was a bit of shuffling, and then she heard her spit. "Stop that." The footsteps that followed were hard. She knew about this. The king was to marry her Aunt Lyanna once upon a time, but she had died at the end of the war. That was why he was married to Queen Cersei, as it were. But why did the Kingslayer care so much? Either way, now she had something else to watch out for when she went down. She could have reconsidered, on pain of getting caught, but she didn't want to stay upstairs another moment. She took a quick look down the hall and then ran for the front doors. Okay, so I like this. One thing that's been consistent from Prophs 2.0 to the first draft of this version of Prophs 3.0 is the fact that Arya very deliberately has her and Bran listen in on this conversation like, "Oh man, look at what we're hearing." Here, she just overhears it by accident, basically. I think this makes sense because I can't really figure out why Arya would care about any of this stuff to the point where she would turn to Bran and be like, "Oh man, you gotta hear what the Kingslayer is saying." Like, and yes, while this moment is important, one of the questions that I kept having after reading the old versions of this chapter is why is it Arya that needs to hear this? Here, at least, it makes it seem like Arya just kind of heard this, and then it's used to establish the fact that, like, oh, Robert was betrothed to Lyanna, but she's dead, he's clearly still in love with her, and all that stuff. And it doesn't seem as, like, deliberate, because the deliberate, or what is the word? The deliberate nature makes it not make sense. But anyway, let's keep going. Without a coat on, she finally felt how absolutely frigid it was getting. Maybe the season was finally going to change. It had been summer since before she was born. The dry dirt crunched under her feet as she moved toward the older part of the grounds. Here, newer buildings of cinder and brick ran out, replaced by towers of the gray stone that made up the great keep and the castle walls. In a wall, between the original keep and an old tower whose top had been blackened by lightning, was an archway that led to a secluded courtyard, its ground soft with springy lichen. The doors that led to the crypts were set into the wall of the original keep, on the left side. She imagined that, at some point in the past, they'd have been heavy and hard to open, but the centuries had rotted away the edges and made the wood soft. Even better, they were already propped open by an old metal pail filled with sand. Arya took one tentative look over her shoulder before she slipped into the darkness. The air was even colder in here and hung thin and dry. She used the light from the door to see her way down the steps, hewn from the stone the castle was built on. At the bottom, she stepped into a long tunnel of stone and soil and dark splintering wood. The tombs of the Starks of old lined the walls on both sides, marked by statues of their likenesses. The heads had iron swords at their laps and stone direwolves wrapped around their feet. Her aunt, along with her uncle and grandfather, were further down, and the older graves, the kings of the Highlands, were a level below. So I wanted to note here that there's a little bit of a discrepancy between John's chapter and Arya's chapter, despite what I just said. So in John's chapter, he specifically refers to the kings of winter from the books as the kings of the north. Here, Arya's chapter refers to them with an Irish word that I don't know how to pronounce. But I specifically used it because it was gender neutral, because at this point in the history, the Northerners, or maybe this was just the word I used, but I think it's because at this point in the history, the Northerners, or the first men in general, went from being a patriarchal society to a more egalitarian one. So not all of the quote unquote kings of winter would have actually been kings. So I just kind of took a word from Irish Gaelic and threw it in there and said, this is a gender neutral version. It means leader, I'm pretty sure, rather than king or queen. So there's that. But I just wanted to note that because it's kind of weird that John's chapter specifically refers to them as kings, where here Arya uses the actual Gaelic word. But anyway, she moved to a large wooden beam and sat down on the ground beside it, in front of the grave of a great-great-great-aunt. Goodness, she hated all this. She met plenty of important people before, but it wasn't anything like this. Of course, they'd all been from the north, like her, not the south. Up until today, the only southerners she even knew were her mother and the attendants she brought north when she married father. Northerners didn't require all this ceremony, it seemed. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to live there. Foreshadowing. She leaned her head against the wood and tried to soak in the quiet, but the sound of far-off voices wouldn't let her. Instead, she became curious. She could distinguish the king's curling tones from her father's more familiar sound. When she began to understand what they were saying, she realized that they were moving. Lord Eddard Stark, she heard the king say, I would name you Hand of the King. The sound of that made her sit up. She knew it. When she peeked past the wood, she could see the silhouettes in the flickering light of the lantern. Her father was down on one knee. I'm not worthy of the title, he said to him. Please, the king scoffed. 18 years old and you still want to talk about honor. Who else would I choose to rule this kingdom while I eat and drink myself to death? He let out a laugh. King's Landing is a pit of vipers. I need some voice of reason before they swallow me whole. You helped me win the dragon's mouth. Now help me hold it. The Iron Throne is referred to as the dragon's mouth in this version of prophs. The south is no place for a northerner, her father countered. Did you tell your father that before he sent you to the Eyrie? Off your knees, you, the king commanded. If Lyanna were still here, you'd be bound by blood. We might still be. You have a daughter and I have a son. We'll join our houses. Sansa is only 13, your grace. You act as if I've asked for Arya. The king chuckled. It's not too soon for the betrothal. They can wed when Joffrey comes of age. Your honor do you that, Ned. Of course, your grace. Father swung the lantern as he gestured for the king to go ahead of him. Can I have time for consideration, though? I must inform my wife and the children. Of course, just don't keep me waiting. So I think it's worth noting that in this version, the part where Robert very loudly is like, take me to your crypts, I'd like to pay my respects, and then Cersei is just kind of like, but doesn't say anything. That's in there for a reason in the books, because it's meant to show the fact that, like, despite the fact that Robert has clearly been married for, like, years at this point, he still has feelings for the dead girl that he never got to marry. And the fact that he would say that when his actual wife is standing, like, right there, and right after, in the books especially, because she's like, oh, maybe we should just wait, and Robert's just like, all right, take me down, that says something about their relationship. The fact that that's not here is actually really interesting. But I'm guessing the same sort of statement is made when you hear Jaime and Cersei's little argument about the fact that Robert went and did that. It gives off a different feeling, though, because we don't actually see that moment. But anyway, the two men went quiet as they moved back down the corridor, the lantern becoming brighter as they neared. The silence amongst them grew heavy as the shadows danced on the walls. She was suddenly stricken with a shiver. Standing amongst the tombs of her ancestors, she couldn't help but think of ghosts. Damn this infernal place, the king said, breaking the silence. It's no place for her. Would that I could have buried her in the godswood, your grace, under the heart where the sun would reach, but she asks to be here. My honor did me that. I'd curse your honor, but I need it now. Her father stopped a moment as the king went ahead of him. How did Robert get behind him? I thought Ned already let him in front. Whatever. Why do you keep such places, Ned? He asked back. Arya flitted to the other side of the beam where she hid. When her father looked back, he saw nothing there. A dark, cold place full of ghosts, the king said. There are no ghosts here, your grace, her father explained as he returned to his side. The direwolves keep the old lords in their tombs. No man would cross them. The king nodded. Let's hope the same is true in life. And that's the end of that chapter. So, This chapter was fine. I'm not like particularly enamored with it. It's definitely not bad though, and I don't hate it. I wouldn't even say that I like disliked it in any way. It's fine. I just am not like, oh my god, this is great. But what I will say is that this chapter is miles better than the first draft of it from the last version that we read in the last episode. And I think what really makes it is that this chapter really tries to center Arya's feelings, despite the fact that none of the events that happen in the chapter directly impact her. And I like that because, as I've said a million times before at this point, it makes me feel like there is a reason why I'm seeing this through her POV in particular, rather than any other character. And that was one of my biggest problems with the last version of this. The fact that it was Arya's POV, but again, the chapter was clearly more about Ned and what was going on with him. And I think what really contributes to that in this chapter is the fact that Arya doesn't deliberately seek out any of the stuff that happens to Ned, you know what I mean? The same way that she doesn't deliberately turn to Bran and go, oh man, let's listen in on what Jaime and Cersei are talking about. She doesn't tell Bran, let's go down to the crypts to overhear if Dad's being named Hand of the King. Because when she does that, it makes it seem like I tried to take the original Ned chapter and tell it through her POV just so I could have it without trying to plagiarize the original chapter directly. Like, it seems like a cheap trick. Here, because we keep talking about how Arya feels about all this stuff and then the other stuff that happens with the adults, she just kind of stumbles across that. It definitely feels like this chapter is more about her and establishes her as a character. And I really like that. So yeah, this chapter is good. It's actually really good. In general, this entire draft of this version of Prophs is really decent, you know? It's definitely an improvement on the last version that we read. I think it was good that I decided to sit down and actually rewrite a lot of this stuff because it really helped. Whereas the other version, you could definitely tell that it was an in-between step between Prophs 2.0 and this. Because while there were parts that I clearly wrote in later, like for example, the first chapter, once they got back to Winterfell and the wolf stuff started happening there, that felt like something that I actually sat down and paid attention to and wrote. You know what I mean? But there are other parts of it that it feels like I clearly was on autopilot and I was just copying and pasting from the old story. The best example of which is probably Jon's chapter, but Arya's first chapter also has vibes of that due to how much of it is just Bran's chapter but rewritten with the new ending put in. So this version, I think, does a good job of getting rid of a lot of those problems. And it does have its own problems, but they're kind of minor. They're things that would have easily been fixed if this had ever gotten edited again, and it never did. So that's the only reason those things are there. And that is the end of our reread of Prophs 3.0. Hooray! Hey guys, Editing Frankie here. So, normally this is the part where I would tell you what the next reread is, but I am actually going to put the fanfic reread project on hiatus for like 2-ish months, if not longer. Partially just because I kind of need a break from editing this every week, and partially because NaNoWriMo is in November, and I don't want to stop posting a reread in the middle of the reread, and the next reread I think has 6 episodes, so that would take over a month to post. So anyway, I am not entirely sure when I am going to get back to this. We'll see how I feel in December. But whenever I do, the next reread is a special reread for Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of the Black Pearl, which is exactly what it says on the tin, a Pirates of the Caribbean fanfic. It's special because that is a published work, and some of my published work I'm not reading for this, but we need that story for context for the story that actually comes after that. But you'll hear more about that whenever I get back to posting it. So if you like this episode, like it on the YouTubes, subscribe to the channel and you'll be updated on when the next episode comes out, or whatever the new video is when you are watching this, because I plan on having something out on Halloween, but we'll see what happens. It would also be super helpful if you guys could check out the backlog. You can catch up on the rest of this series as well as checking out other rereads I've done. There are 2 previous Prophs rereads before this one, so you can check out those and get some context for some of the stuff that I was talking about, especially in the earlier episodes. And like I said, I will see you guys for whatever I happen to upload next.